They said she was a queen who loved too fiercely, a woman who refused to let death steal her husband from her bed. When the king was struck down, his body broken, his crown slipping into silence, she did not bury him as tradition demanded. She cut away what she could not part with, his head, preserved, hidden, sealed in a carved box that never left her side. Servants whispered of her muttering through the night, her lips pressed against the lid, as if it were still skin, as if the man inside might answer back. Years passed. The court grew uneasy, for the queen's box followed her everywhere, into her chambers, to her feasts, even to her prayers. And then came the day when it was opened. Inside lay strands of his hair, yellowed bone, and a smear of fresh lipstick painted across what remained of his mouth. Tell me, was this devotion beyond death, or madness that feasted on rot? They began to call her many names behind sealed doors. To the common folk, she was the Black Widow of the throne. To the courtiers, she was the keeper of the king. But to herself, she claimed no name, only silence, only devotion. The box was never left behind. At councils, it rested on the table beside her hand. At banquets, it sat where her husband's plate once lay. Even in prayer, priests noticed her fingers caressing its edges, as though she asked blessing not for the living, but for the thing that lingered in the dark. When her son was crowned as the new monarch, it should have marked a turning of eras. Yet the boy was overshadowed, a pale ornament beside his mother's obsession. Every decree bore her voice, every law her shadow, as if the box itself gave final approval. Ministers sat rigid in fear, for whenever debate grew tense, she would glance toward the carved container, smile faintly, and end the argument with words no one dared challenge. He would agree with me. Stories spread like wildfire. Maids whispered that she painted her lips freshly each night before pressing them against the wood, leaving faint stains across its edges. Guards swore they heard muffled conversations, her voice rising and breaking as though another spoke through her. Some claimed her laughter no longer sounded human, but cracked and hollow, echoing from the box itself. And as the years bled forward, her rituals deepened. Each anniversary of his death, she locked herself in her chamber with the box for 3 days. When she emerged, her lips were bruised red, her hands trembling, her eyes brighter than before. Political rot matched the personal. Foreign envoys demanded proof of the king's burial. Trade faltered, treaties crumbled. One ambassador, braver than the rest, dared to ask directly where the king's body lay. The queen's answer chilled the hall. She lifted the box onto the banquet table, kissed it before the assembly, and whispered, "Would you like me to open it for you?" The envoy recoiled, hands shaking, and left without completing his mission. From that day, fewer dared to cross her court. But the paranoia within the palace walls swelled. Servants vanished. Those who spoke too loudly about the queen's rituals were never seen again. A handmaiden once confessed to seeing the lid slightly ajar. Inside, not dust and rot as expected, but something disturbingly fresh. Strands of hair that seemed soft to touch, a thin patch of leathery skin stretched across bone, and painted lips marked in red. She ran to tell another, but by morning her quarters were empty, her belongings burned. No records of her name remained. The queen grew thinner with time, yet her authority only sharpened. Her nails grew long and sharp, always tapping lightly on the lid, as if to summon her husband from within. At times, she demanded wine be poured onto the box, murmuring that the king was thirsty. At others, she stroked the carved wood until her hands trembled, then lifted her fingers to her own mouth, as if feeding on his presence. Courtiers swore that when she left the chamber, the air smelled faintly of perfume and rot. The most chilling tale came from a single midnight. A young guard, stationed at her door, swore he heard 2 voices speaking inside, one soft, one deep and rasping. He held his post until dawn, paralyzed, before confessing to his commander. When the story reached the queen, the guard was summoned. He entered her chamber. He never returned. His armor was found days later at the edge of the palace moat, stripped bare, as though the man inside had dissolved into nothing. What remained constant, through whispers and vanishing servants, was the queen's smile, painted red, cold, and perfect, mirroring the same crimson smear later found across the bone-white grin of her husband's skull. Devotion or madness? That question tore through the palace, unspoken yet undeniable, and all the while the queen slept with the box nestled beside her pillow, whispering into it, as though the dead man whispered back. They whispered of her as the widow of whispers. It was said she no longer governed with reason, but with the murmurs that slipped between her lips, and the unseen voice she claimed replied from within the box. Ministers obeyed her decrees not because of loyalty, but because silence meant survival. Dissent was a gamble, for the queen carried both crown and coffin in one hand. Her court became a theater of unease. Banquets stretched long into the night, where laughter died quickly when the box appeared at the table. She lifted her glass to it, toasted in hushed tones, then drained her wine as though drinking for two. Musicians played softer, servants tiptoed quicker, and nobles who had once vied for favor now fought only to avoid her gaze. For when her eyes narrowed, it was as though her late husband himself glared from within. The boy king, her son, grew into a man beneath this shadow, but his voice never found strength. Each time he spoke, his mother would hush him with a raised hand, then tilt her head toward the box. "Your father would not approve," she whispered. His crown gleamed, but it was hollow, for the true power lay in the coffin of carved wood beside his mother's chair. Some said the prince feared the box more than he feared his mother. Some said he prayed not for his kingdom, but for the silence of that other voice. Over the years, the queen's rituals reached beyond whispers. On holy days, she ordered the clergy to bless the box as though it were relic. Priests who refused were dismissed, their positions replaced by those willing to kneel before bone and rot. The cathedral bells rang in honor of the dead king, though no body lay in consecrated ground. Instead, his skull rested in her chambers, kissed nightly, guarded like the holiest of treasures. Religion bent beneath obsession, reshaped by the will of one woman and her coffin of devotion. Foreign courts began to sneer. Songs were sung of the corpse queen who ruled through decay. Some mocked, but others grew cautious. A ruler who clung to death could not be predicted. Rumors spread that she dabbled in necromancy, that her beauty, though fading, was kept alive by oils mixed with ash of the dead. Merchants who visited her lands swore that her gaze pierced through them, as though a second presence looked with her. Alliances faltered, wars threatened, yet she clung tighter still to the only thing she claimed she could not lose. But paranoia eats faster than grief. Inside her court, loyalty eroded. Ministers plotted, not against her alone, but against the box. One night, whispers of conspiracy reached her ears. 3 nobles had gathered, daring to question whether the king's remains should be destroyed for the good of the realm. By dawn, their houses were silent, doors locked, families vanished, and their crests were torn down from palace walls. Nothing was spoken of them again. And when the queen appeared at council that day, her nails were stained faintly red, as though she had painted something other than her lips. The box itself began to change. What once had been sealed tightly was now rumored to open at her touch. Servants claimed she polished the skull inside, combed the brittle hair, and sometimes painted lips red, as though the bone itself required cosmetics. She spoke to it by candlelight, caressed it with trembling hands, and when exhaustion overtook her, she curled against it in sleep. Her attendants swore they found her in the mornings with the skull laid openly beside her, as though she had embraced it through the night. Then came the night that broke even the strongest hearts. A fire swept through part of the palace, sparked by accident or sabotage. While courtiers fled, the queen did not move. She stood at her window, the box clutched tight, her voice rising in chants none recognized. Flames reflected in her eyes as she lifted the skull above her head, screaming that the king would not be taken again. Guards dragged her from the chamber against her will. When the fire was doused, they found her rooms blackened, but the box untouched, preserved as though the flames themselves bowed to it. From then on, fear became law. She demanded that anyone entering her presence bow first to the box, and only then to her. Those who hesitated met the same fate as the vanished servants. Her son, now a man, grew pale and silent. He longed to rule, yet trembled at the weight of the legacy he was chained to. For he knew one truth whispered by all and denied by none. His father's rotting head ruled more firmly from a coffin than he ever could from a throne. And so, the queen's legend deepened. Not as a woman, nor as a widow, but as something other, a priestess of death, a bride of decay. She was the widow of whispers, the keeper of secrets too foul to utter, the one who lay beside death and called it love. They called her the queen of the box now, though none dared utter it where her ears might hear. For years she had clutched it, whispered to it, kissed it. But now her devotion twisted into something far darker, something that reached beyond mourning into rule itself. The skull had become sovereign, and the kingdom bent beneath it. Her chambers transformed into shrines. Candles burned in circles around the box, incense thick enough to choke the air. Witnesses said she spent nights kneeling before it, rocking gently, her voice carrying lullabies once sung in the king's lifetime. At times, she was heard laughing, low and tender. At others, sobbing so violently that servants outside her door wept in terror. They swore another voice sometimes joined hers, a guttural rasp, faint but steady, that cut through the silence like a blade. None dared open the door. By day, her rituals spilled into governance. She insisted all royal decrees be spoken aloud to the box before sealed with her mark. Letters to foreign rulers carried her handwriting, but also faint smears of red wax along the parchment edges, as though the box itself had pressed approval. Ministers who questioned the practice vanished. One advisor dared to claim the people murmured unrest. Days later, his tongue was nailed to the palace gate. His body was never found. The message was clear. Dissent against her was dissent against the king, and dissent against the king was death. The boy king, grown but voiceless, shrank further into shadow. He feared the mother who silenced him, but more, he feared the father who lingered in that wooden coffin. His crown weighed nothing compared to the invisible power of the skull. At night, when whispers carried through the palace halls, some swore they heard not one voice but two, the queen's tremulous murmur and a hollow rasp that answered. Whether imagination or truth, none dared investigate. Her obsession birthed superstition. Soldiers swore the box protected them in battle, that arrows turned aside when carried beneath its blessing. Peasants claimed crops grew taller when paraded under its presence. But as devotion spread, so too did fear. A farmer accused of mocking the queen was dragged before her. She lifted the lid and pressed the skull's grin to his face. He fainted, convulsing, and by dawn, he was dead. The tale raced across villages. Proof, they said, that the king still judged the living. Foreign lands recoiled. Ambassadors refused to stay overnight within her palace, claiming dreams of voices scratching inside their skulls. Merchants left contracts unsigned, unwilling to feast where the box sat at the table. Enemies at the borders whispered that the realm was cursed, that it rotted from within, that the queen had traded her soul to keep her husband near. Some declared open war, convinced a kingdom ruled by the dead was already halfway to falling. Inside the palace, terror reigned. Servants entered her chamber at night and never returned. Ministers obeyed her hand, even as tremors betrayed their fear. And through it all, the box grew more present, more open. Witnesses swore they saw her paint the skull's lips with crimson pigment, then press her own mouth against it, smearing red upon bone and flesh alike. She stroked its hair, combed the brittle strands, murmured lullabies as though comforting a child. When exhaustion overtook her, she lay beside it, embracing it like a lover. Yet, madness rarely hides quietly. The queen began to hold audiences where she addressed the box as if it were her co-ruler. Nobles stood in silence as she asked it questions, then paused, waiting for an answer only she could hear. When she replied aloud, her tone shifted, sometimes deeper, harsher, colder, as though her husband's voice clawed through her throat. On such days, none dared meet her eyes, for behind them, they swore, flickered another's gaze entirely. One winter, famine struck the land. Grain withered, bellies emptied, and cries of hunger echoed through the streets. Ministers begged her to release the royal stores. Instead, she retreated to her chamber, locked away for 3 days. When she emerged, her lips were raw, her hands trembling. She declared the king had spoken. The people would endure hunger, for suffering was a test of loyalty. Hundreds starved before merchants smuggled grain across borders. But those who survived believed the king's skull had tested them and found them faithful. Still, rebellion stirred. In one village, banners were raised against her, painted with the words, "Let the dead rest." The queen's fury was swift. She ordered the skull paraded into the square, placed upon a pedestal before the starving crowd. As drums pounded, she forced the villagers to kneel, one by one, before the box. Those who refused were dragged into the shadows, their screams cut short. By dawn, the square was silent. The rebellion ended before it began. The villagers returned to their homes, eyes downcast, never speaking of defiance again. The longer she clung to her relic, the more her kingdom decayed. Fields lay fallow, armies scattered. Even the boy king, grown now to a man, remained a shadow, powerless to stop the withering of his inheritance. Some whispered he plotted against his mother, but when he gathered courage to speak, she silenced him with a glance toward the box. He lowered his head, always. But the people saw. They muttered in taverns, they whispered in markets, not of rebellion against the queen, but against the box itself. They believed if it were destroyed, freedom might return. Yet none dared touch it, for stories said those who laid hands upon it were struck down, either by the queen's hand or by something unseen. Shadows moved in the halls at night, voices rasped where none should be. The skull had become more than bone. It had become the crown. Then came the night of the procession. She ordered the skull paraded through the streets, draped in silks, guarded by armed men. Thousands gathered. Some bowed. Some spat in secret. As the queen walked behind it, her face painted pale, lips red as blood, the crowd grew restless. a child cried out. The queen turned, furious, and lifted the box high. Silence fell. "He is with you," she declared. "He watches you still." Her words echoed, and the people shuddered. For in that moment, they swore the skull's grin widened. That night, when she returned to her chamber, she slept with the skull beside her pillow as always. But servants swore they heard 2 sets of breathing through the door, one soft, one harsh. And when dawn came, the queen emerged pale, lips shining red, eyes bright with madness. She smiled and whispered, "He spoke again." From that day forward, fear became religion. The box was not just relic, not just coffin, it was law. And the queen, fevered and trembling, smiled as she lay beside it each night, whispering into darkness, awaiting replies only she could hear. Her love had become her prison, and her prison had become her kingdom's cage. The queen's reign had become a pageant of shadows, each day more grotesque than the last. Yet power that thrives on fear is never eternal. Behind locked doors, whispers turned to plans. Not against the queen, few believed she could be reached, but against the object that bound her. The box had become more than relic. It was tyrant, parasite, crown, and curse. The boy king, grown weary and pale, found allies among those who feared the skull's grip. His courtiers urged action, but courage melted whenever the queen's smile crossed their memory. For how does one strike at madness wrapped in sanctity? Still, a conspiracy formed. Ministers, priests, and even generals plotted quietly, convinced that if the skull were destroyed, her spell would break. Some claimed she would collapse without it, shriveling like a flame deprived of air. Others whispered darker, that both queen and kingdom might burn if the skull was harmed. One night, they tried. A servant bribed with gold slipped into her chambers. His task was simple: take the box, cast it into fire, end the terror. But when he touched the lid, the palace shook. The queen awoke instantly, eyes burning, her voice shrieking words in a tongue unknown. Guards found the intruder moments later. His body was whole, unmarked, yet his face was twisted, frozen in agony, his mouth stretched open as though still screaming. They buried him quietly, but fear doubled. If death came merely from touch, who among them could ever finish the task? The queen, sensing betrayal, grew harsher still. She ordered nightly vigils, forcing her ministers to kneel with her before the box, to chant praises to the skull. One refused, collapsing in sobs. She pressed his head against the box until blood streaked its carvings. "Now he understands," she whispered, wiping her lips with her sleeve. No one refused again. Her son watched in silence, broken. He no longer prayed for his father's rest. He prayed only for his mother's end. Yet, he could not act. At banquets, she forced him to toast the skull. In council, she silenced him with the same line: "Your father disapproves." A man who should have ruled a kingdom instead cowered before a box. Knights found him pacing his chambers, muttering to himself, fingers trembling as though he might summon courage. Yet, when footsteps echoed outside, he stilled, trapped by terror that weighed heavier than any crown. But beyond the palace walls, unrest grew louder. Villages whispered of revolt. Bards sang mocking ballads in secret, and foreign powers gathered armies at the borders. The queen dismissed it all. Her world was the box, and the box was all the world she needed. Yet each night, her whispers grew louder, more frantic. Servants passing her door claimed they heard her begging, pleading for guidance. Sometimes they swore they heard laughter answer her. Other times, silence so heavy it made the air groan. The final fracture came during a feast. Nobles sat rigid as she placed the skull openly on the table, draped in silks. She painted its lips crimson before their eyes, pressed her mouth to its teeth, then raised her goblet high. "To the King eternal," she declared. Silence followed. Not a single cup rose. Not a single throat dared echo her toast. Even her son lowered his gaze. In that silence, the queen's smile faltered. For the first time, doubt flickered. Brief, but enough. That night, she clutched the box tighter than ever. She whispered until her throat broke raw, begged until her lips bled red against bone. But no voice answered, only silence. And in silence, fear grows heavier than any scream. She pressed her ear to the skull, desperate for the faintest murmur. Nothing. For the first time in years, she felt truly alone. And that, more than rebellion, more than war, threatened to shatter her. The silence did not leave her. It clung to her skin, heavier than the crown, sharper than any blade. For years, the queen had lived in constant dialogue with the box. Whispers, murmurs, laughter in the night. Now, for the first time, it gave her nothing. The skull stared back, teeth frozen in a grin, but no answer came. The queen began to unravel. She prowled the halls barefoot, clutching the box, demanding that her ministers listen closely, that they too might hear the voice. They bowed, nodded, feigned reverence, but the silence was deafening. The court that once trembled at her devotion now watched her descent with horrified fascination. Her power had always been fragile, balanced on fear and ritual. Without the voice, it was cracking. Her son, grown and hollow-eyed, recognized the shift. For the first time, he saw her not as invincible, but as breakable. Ministers drew closer to him, whispering that the moment was near. Still he hesitated, for love of the mother he could not save, and fear of the relic that seemed to breathe even in stillness. Was it truly silent, or had the voice chosen to speak only to others now? The queen would not accept abandonment. She carved rituals into her own flesh, streaking her arms with lines of ash and wine, crying out for the skull to return its counsel. She locked herself for days, emerging gaunt, her lips raw, her nails chipped to the bone from clawing the wood. Rumors swirled that she had tried to swallow fragments of hair that had fallen loose from the skull, as though consuming what remained of him might restore the bond. Her attendants began to leave their posts. Some fled, others vanished. Foreign armies pressed harder at the borders, sensing weakness. Within the capital, revolt simmered like fire beneath ash. The queen ignored it all. Her world had narrowed to the coffin box and the silence that mocked her. At council she raved, insisting her husband still ruled, accusing ministers of deafness, of treachery, of conspiring to mute the king's voice. Each accusation ended with blood. The palace floors grew slick with it, yet no answer came from the skull. The boy king, urged by allies, finally moved. He did not strike openly. Cowardice or wisdom, none could say. Instead, he allowed a slow rebellion to grow, feeding whispers instead of silencing them. Priests spoke of the natural order, that the dead must rest. Generals muttered that a kingdom cannot march to war behind a skull. Farmers told tales of curses that wither crops. And through it all, the queen screamed louder, as though she could drown the silence with her fury. The breaking point came when she dragged her son before the court. She forced him to kneel beside the box, pressed his forehead to the wood, and demanded he confess loyalty to his father still. But the boy raised his head and said nothing. Not defiance, not obedience, only nothing. The queen slapped him, trembling, her face streaked with tears and paint. "He speaks through me," she cried, lifting the skull high. Yet no sound filled the hall, only silence, and the silence spread, thick and suffocating. That night, as she lay in her chamber with the skull beside her, she whispered until her breath cracked, screamed until her throat bled. Still the skull gave her nothing. Servants passing swore they heard her sobbing like a child. For the first time, the queen's terror was not of losing her husband. It was of realizing he had left her long ago, and she had been whispering to rot all along. When the end came, it was not with fire or rebellion, but with silence. A silence thicker than stone, heavier than grief. One morning, servants entered her chambers and found the queen lying upon her bed, the box clasped to her chest. Her lips were painted, her eyes open wide, but her breath was gone. She had died in her sleep, or so they told the people. Yet those who stood closest swore they heard a faint rasp as they pried the box from her arms, as if a sigh escaped from within. The skull was still there, the same brittle hair, the same hollow sockets, the same teeth stretched in a grin. But across its mouth was a stain, wet and red, as though freshly kissed only moments before. The sight chilled the court. Some said it was proof her spirit lingered, caught between devotion and decay. Others whispered that in her final breath she had given herself fully to the skull, merging with it, leaving nothing behind but painted flesh and bone. Her son, now king in name and power, ordered the box sealed and buried in secret. No tomb bore its name, no prayers were spoken over it. But secrecy rarely buries fear. Rumors claimed the coffin never reached the ground, that soldiers tasked with its burial vanished one by one, that in the deepest hour of night, laughter echoed from the cart that carried it away. And some swore the queen's corpse, though interred, never decayed, her lips still red, as though she had kissed bone only hours before. The king ruled, but his reign bore her shadow. He banned mention of the skull, forbade priests from speaking her name, yet he never married. He never bore heirs. At night, he was seen wandering palace corridors, pausing at locked doors, listening as though for whispers. Some said he dreamed of his mother, standing at his bedside with the box in her hands. Some said he woke screaming, swearing he heard his father's voice rasping from the dark. The line of succession ended with him, as though the curse of the skull had devoured not just one life, but an entire dynasty. But legends grow where wounds refuse to heal. In distant villages, travelers told of a woman in pale gowns, wandering by moonlight, clutching a carved box against her breast. They claimed she whispered softly to it, pausing at crossroads to listen for replies. In some tales, the box was empty. In others, it was said to contain not only a skull, but fragments of flesh, warm as though never dead at all. Children were warned never to linger near crossroads at night, lest the queen's whispers follow them home. And so, the question endures. Did the queen die clutching rot, or did she join it? Was her devotion not to a memory, but to something that listened and answered, long after breath should have ceased? If love is strong enough to deny death, then what do we call the thing it creates? Devotion or damnation? They said she was a queen who loved too fiercely, who carried her husband's rotting head into eternity. But listen closer. In some places, when night is deepest, they say her whispers still drift through stone. And if one listens too long, if one dares to lean too close, perhaps the skull will answer again. Perhaps the cycle begins anew. And perhaps somewhere, another lover will refuse to let go. For the dead may rest, but devotion does not. It lingers, it festers, it waits. And in the dark, silence is never truly silent.